Robert? Oh, here, right here. Are you, Charles Jordan McMillan? Yeah, your personal trainer, Rock. He told me you'd be here. Dr. Burks has some questions he wanted me.
Dr. Burks, huh?
Yeah. No, your nutritionist sent me, so if you'll have a seat.
I'm a little sweaty, I've been running.
It's gonna go right. That's all right, I can smell it. We're gonna have to put the candy down. It's gonna pull this back, because it might hinder the results a little bit.
Really? No, thank you.
Here's what we're gonna do. I'm just gonna ask you some questions. It'll be quick, it'll be easy. Again, just tell the truth. All right, do you consider yourself a health nut?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
No, I'm working on it, I'm trying. No.
Okay, good. How often do you exercise?
Every day. 2 times a week.
Now let's be honest, how often do you exercise?
All right, no times a week.
Hold on 1 second. Oh, sorry. Shake your hand for me, like this. Okay. Have you ever actually done yoga in your yoga pants?
Yes. No.
Basically, they're like my shopping
You
clothes.
could do a little less of this. Do you adhere to your gluten-free diet?
No.
Yes.
Gluten what?
Thank you, that's all I need to know. It's a gnat, sorry. Have you ever put your Fitbit on your dog in an attempt to increase your step count?
I wouldn't do that and then film it. That's very interesting that you would know that, but no. Those are mine.
When we're done, if you're honest, you can have a red one. The weight on your driver's license correct?
Yes.
I mean, we're all friends here.
I'm sure I was 200 pounds at one point in my life.
Do you regret the last time you ate a whole pan of brownies?
No.
Regret? I have no regrets.
Were they good?
No, actually I don't.
What kind were they?
They were Duncan Hines. Honest to God.
Well, hey, I hope you've been enjoying those videos as much as me. I've been really finding this series quite helpful as I've been preparing and delivering these messages. I found some areas in my own life where I've had to be honest to God about some things, and we were talking about that at community group on Wednesday night. So I hope that many of you have been finding this series helpful, finding those videos enjoyable. Maybe the email series that we've been doing on a daily basis, that you've been finding that helpful as well as we've gone through that. I've heard a lot of feedback from you guys about that, and I hope that you've been enjoying that. Before we get going this morning, next week we're starting a brand new series, and as with every new series, it's a great time to invite someone, and so we wanted to just try and create a tool that you could use to invite someone next week. For the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about this idea of a relationship with God. For the next couple of weeks, we're going to be talking about relationships with the people around us, and each and every one of us have a relationship where there is bad blood in that relationship, or we have a relationship where there is one sentence or one thing that we might say that is one step away from having bad blood in that relationship. And so what we've done is we've created a door hanger that you can put on someone's door. So you can either do this at work, you could do it with a friend of yours around there as well. And what we've done is we've tried to create 2 tools. One is if you have a rival, a sports rival, maybe you've got a friend who's got a different soccer team from you, or a cricket team or a rugby team, and you're rivals in that moment, you can grab one of these that says, you may be rivals on a Saturday, but hey, we want to have, hang with me on Sunday morning. So you can grab one of those. The other one is that we have one that says, we might be rivals during the week. And you could use that with your boss maybe. I don't know. You could use that with a colleague at work, maybe a friend, or you could just use it with your moody teenager. I don't know. You might have bad blood between you and your teenager as well. And so you can grab one of those at the door there at the tables as you leave. Grab one of those and hand those out as an invitation for you to be able to come to bring someone next week. So that's Bad Blood starting next week. We're really excited about kicking that series off as we get going next week. Today, as we kind of conclude this series of Honest to God, as we get going with today, I want to try and just give you what the big idea is and kind of give us all a little recap of where we've been going. The big idea really is that we all have a faith in God. We all talk about faith a lot, don't we? We talk about this idea of having a faith in God. And faith is a great thing, but we want something more for you than that. We want you all to have faith in God, but we want something more than that. We want you to know God. We all want you to have a belief in God, but more than that, we want you to be in a relationship with God. And so what we've been talking about is this big idea, and we've said that until you are fully honest to God, you will not experience God fully. That there is a potential of a relationship that we can have with God, but until we are fully open, fully honest, that we bring our full selves to that relationship, until we do that, we will not experience God fully. We said it a different way, that being honest to God allows us to have a closer relationship with God. That being honest to God allows you and I to have a closer relationship with God. Really, the kind of the buzzword for this series is really a word, intimacy. That intimacy is kind of a word that we would all use to describe what a relationship we would want to have with God. In fact, regardless of your religious belief, if you're a Christian or a non-Christian, I think that each and every one of us desires to have an intimate relationship with God where we are fully loved, where we are fully known. We all want that in those moments. But what stands in the way of that? Honestly, it's honesty. Honesty is sometimes hard for many of us. It kind of gets in the way. I mean, we tend to hide the good parts of ourselves from our friends, from Facebook, from our social media accounts. We hide those honest moments sometimes. And honesty is hard with God as well. We tend to hide. We tend to push the bad parts of ourselves away. We don't want to reveal that to God in any way. And so there are definitely some, so the key kind of to having a full relationship with God is really honesty. But there's some kind of guys that get in the way. There's some people that get in the way. There's some things that get in the way of that. There's some enemies to this idea of honesty. And one of them we looked at last week was this idea of doubt. That when this emotion rises inside of us, that there's a feeling that gets in the way. It obstructs what we know to be true. In fact, last week we said this, that being honesty to God creates a relationship strong enough to bear the weight of doubt. That if you and I are able to be full in our honesty to God, that we're able to say to him, hey, this is who I am. God, I believe you're there, but I don't believe that you're for me. I don't believe that you have my best interests at heart. When I look at the chaos that's happening in the world around me, God, I'm not so sure that you really are for me in those moments. Being able to have a relationship with God where we're completely open and honest, that we bring our doubts, that God invites us to bring those doubts, we're able to have a strong enough relationship to bear the weight of any doubt. Now, if enemy number one we looked at last week was doubt, enemy number two this week has to be the word guilt. Anybody excited about talking about guilt? No, because guilt's not a fun word, is it? Guilt is not something that we like jazzed about, that we want to talk about for a long time. But I do know this to be true, that everyone knows everyone is guilty of something. I thought about putting up there that everyone is guilty of something, but that's a little too personal, isn't it? I don't know you that well, you don't know me that well. But I do think that is true, that everyone knows that everyone is guilty of something. Now, the word for the day being guilt, that word for the day, it kind of has two forms, two meanings, two ideas around it. The first one is that of being guilty. That being guilty. When I say being guilty, some words might pop into your head like law, a court, maybe fact, maybe the speed limit for some of you. How many of you keep the speed limit? I don't know. You either are guilty or you are not guilty. A court of law might decide whether you are guilty or not. The other side, the other word that is in the midst of this is feeling guilty. Feeling guilty. Feeling guilty is so much worse than being guilty, isn't it? I don't know if any of you have ever received a text, maybe from a significant other, maybe from a boss in my case, and it's, hey, won't you pop past the office? We need to talk. What's the first thing that comes into your mind? For me, I'm done. I'm fired. I need to check my LinkedIn profile. Is it up to date? Is my CV done? Have I gone through all my emails to make sure I haven't missed anything important? That's instinctively where our minds go. You see, there's this idea of being guilty, and there's an idea of feeling guilty, that being guilty is more about what we have done. Feeling guilty is about who we are. It's a deeper thing that is going on inside of us. Being guilty is about what you have done. Feeling guilty is about who we are. And maybe that is one of the main reasons why you've kind of stiff-armed God. You've kind of said, no, I don't want to kind of have a relationship with God. I know God, I have a belief in God, but really, I'm kind of keeping him at arm's length because whenever I'm with him, I feel guilty. Whenever I'm around the people, when I'm at church, I feel guilty. Maybe when you're kind of around people who associate themselves with him, with God, you feel guilty. I mean, I don't know if you've got people in your life that make you feel guilty all the time. What do you do with those people? You tend to avoid them. You want to stay away from them. Why? Because no one likes feeling guilty. No one likes feeling guilty. But the interesting thing about these two words is that you can be guilty and not feel guilty. You can feel guilty and not be guilty. And very unfortunately, you can be guilty and feel guilty at the same time. So what I kind of want to do for the rest of our time together this morning as we unpack this idea is try and find a way forward. That there is a way that we might be guilty We might have done something wrong. We might be guilty in whatever that circumstance is, but there is a way that we cannot feel guilty, that we can walk around the rest of our lives and not feel guilty. That something has happened, that there is an opportunity, that there is a way forward for us to not feel guilty in those moments. You see, what's interesting about being guilty and feeling guilty is that on the inside, we tend to try and hide those feelings, don't we? I mean, what do we do when we feel guilty? Sometimes we make others pay for it. Sometimes the people around us get hurt as we're trying to deal with our guilt. Some of us assume maybe a victim or a martyr complex. Everything's about us. And some of us just try and dismiss it. We squash it. We try and hide it. We try and avoid it. But there really is a way forward. And I hope that we're going to discover that together this morning. We've been looking throughout this series at a character named David from the Old Testament who wrote the majority of the book of Psalms. And what's interesting about him is Psalms is kind of like his journal that we get to read. And it's very interesting as we unpack it. But when I mention David, there is a name that is synonymous with David, and that is David and Goliath. But the story we're telling today, we cannot teach the children in Wonderland and Upstreet because David and Goliath is a great story for them, but the story of David and Bathsheba is not a great story for children to hear about. And if you don't believe me, you should read your Bible because it's really, really interesting. I'll give you a little bit of a synopsis of David and Bathsheba. Bathsheba is a really interesting character. Bathsheba is described as a gorgeous woman, a very beautiful woman. And David is guilty of something. David is guilty of not being where he is supposed to be. Anybody else done that before? No? No confessionals today? Fine. He's found himself at home, sleeping in one morning. He has the chef make him some breakfast, and he takes a stroll out on his patio. And while he's out on the patio, he overlooks the city or wherever he's looking, and he manages to catch a glimpse of Bathsheba. And he thinks she is drop-dead gorgeous, and he wants to meet her. So he calls one of his servants over and says, hey, can you go fetch her? I want to meet her. And since he's the king, you do whatever the king says, right? And so he goes and the servant goes and fetches Bathsheba, brings her back. And they start chatting. They start getting to know each other. I don't know if they friended each other on Facebook. I don't know what that might look like. But they got to know each other pretty well because David ends up sleeping with Bathsheba. Bathsheba falls pregnant, and David realizes, I need to do something about this. And I need to do something about it fast. Now, Bathsheba's husband, Uriah, was where he was supposed to be. He was out at war. He was doing what he was supposed to be doing. And so David thinks, he's got the solution. He's going to bring Uriah back from war, which he does, gets him drunk one night, hoping that that Bathsheba is going to sleep with Uriah, and that somehow in his really undue mind right there and then, that this is going to kind of be their child, that he can make this look like their child. And that doesn't work. So David has to come up with another plan. And so he decides that he's going to send Uriah not out just to war, to be managing whatever he's doing, but actually to go out to the front lines and essentially be murdered. So David, a man after God's own heart, has committed adultery. He's lied about it. And now he has murdered someone. And for about a year, David thinks like he's gotten away with this. David thinks like, hey, no one's talking about this. I'm kind of getting away with this. The coast seems to be clear. But in 2 Samuel chapter 12, as the story continues for us, we discover that there's this man named Nathan. He's a prophet, and he's sent with the horrific task of unveiling to David his sin. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't want to go to the king and tell him what he's done wrong. I think he knows, but I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to be the fool guy. And so Nathan walks up and decides that in that moment he's going to tell David a story. And the story goes like this, that one day there was a rich man. The rich man had a lot of land. He had a lot of livestock, a lot of sheep, a lot of cattle, a lot of lambs, a lot of animals on his land. And there was a little house on his property that a poor man lived in. And the poor man had very little. The poor man only had one little ewe lamb. And Nathan puts this little detail in the story, which is kind of weird, but makes sense later down in the story. He says that this poor man loved this lamb so much that at night he slept with it in his arms. It's a weird detail, but it makes sense a little bit later on. So one day a traveler comes into town, and it's customary for a traveler, if you're receiving a traveler, for you to make a meal for the traveler. And so the rich man decides, no, he's going to put on a braai and braai some lamb chops. And he goes down, and instead of taking one of his own lambs, he takes the poor man's one and only lamb. He has it slaughtered, has it cut up, braais the lamb chops, and serves it to his guest. And in this moment, David's sitting there, and he's enraged. The anger wells up inside of him, and he says, surely this man should die. And in a moment of drama, Nathan turns to him and says, but David, you are that man. You have done exactly that. You could have had anything, you could have had anyone, but you chose Uriah's one wife. How dare you? And what's amazing to me is that in Psalm 51, we have, and it's really amazing that we still get to be able to delve into this, but in Psalm 51, we have the very words that David prayed to God when his guilt was exposed. We have the very prayer, the very conversation with God that he has with God as his guilt is exposed in that moment. David says this, have mercy on me, O God. God, I'm not blaming anyone else. I've done this. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. That phrase that we looked at last week, talking about this covenantal, this loyal love that God has for you and for me. God, according to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. He starts by saying, God, I'm guilty of this. There's no denying that. And God, you are great. You can do all things. But then he moves into this level of ownership. And I want you to just have a look at this next verse, because just look how many my's appear in this verse. How much ownership David takes into this next verse. He says this, wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions and my sin is always before me. But David, you were getting away with this. The coast was clear. It looked like you weren't telling anybody about this. You were good. No, it wasn't. It was eating me alive. I knew what was going on inside of me. I knew it was my sin. I knew what was happening inside of me. But David, you were almost getting away with this. No, it wasn't. It was locked up on the inside, and it was locking me up. Then have a look what he says next. He says, against you, God, you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. And I'm sure Uriah in this moment would have knocked on the door and said, sorry, if he could, sorry to interrupt. No, you sinned against me as well. Remember, you committed adultery with my wife, and you sent me off to be murdered. Remember that? You see, your sin and my sin is going to affect a whole bunch of people for sure. But the sin that you and I commit, maybe you've said something about someone, maybe you've stolen something from someone, you've taken something from someone, you have hurt someone in some way, you have committed a sin against someone. The sin that you have committed, the sin that I have committed against someone, ultimately that sin is against God. Why? Because God is the one who sets the standard of what is right and what is wrong. God is the one who sets the standard of what is right and what is wrong. And David does just that. He says, yes, I've sinned against other people. I have affected other people with my sin. And what we're going to do, what I'm going to have to do to get that right with someone else, we can get to that. But God, I'm coming to you first. You're the one who defines what is right and what is wrong. And God, against you, you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. See, maybe you're sitting here this morning and you feel guilty because of some kind of standard that someone else has set on you. Maybe you feel guilty all the time because of the pressure that you feel from other people. You're not measuring up to someone's standard. I think that if you were to go to God and say, well, what does that look like? And God would say to you, well, are you breaking any of my rules? Are you actually sinning? He might let you off the hook. Because guilt comes from not measuring up to someone's standard. And the person, the single entity that defines what is right and what is wrong is the one who lives in heaven, and that is God. That God is the one who sets the standard of what is right and what is wrong, and you might be living under the pressure of some guilt that might not even be guilt. Maybe you feel guilty because of someone else's standard. Maybe your parents have told you, hey, you need to be doing something else with your life. you should have gone to a different school. Maybe you should be raising your children differently. Maybe you should have had more money by now. Maybe you should be doing something different in your life at this point in time. I don't think God's concerned with that. I don't think you need to feel guilty about that. God might let you off the hook in those moments. Maybe this is the very reason you've kind of taken a step back from God, because you just feel guilty all the time. But David continues here and says, against you, you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. So you are right in your verdict and justified when you judge. God, you are the one who is going to do with me what you're going to do with me. You are the judge. But God, I'm going to come to you first. You set the standard of what is right and wrong. You have defined that. And God, against you, you only have I sinned. You can be the judge of what you are going to do with me. And what's amazing about this is that we find this in Psalm 51, but we also find this in Psalm 32. And Psalm 32 gives us this beautiful description of what David did as he unveils his guilt, as he confesses his guilt, how he does it and what he has done with it and what happens afterwards. In Psalm 32, it says this: when I kept silent, when I hid my guilt, when I hid what I had done, my bones wasted away through the groaning all day long. Have you ever had someone who's groaned about the guilt or the pressure they feel because of something they've done? You had someone in your life who's done that? He carries on and says, For day and night, your hand was heavy on me. My strength was sapped as in the heat of summer. Some of you know exactly what that feels like, don't you? You've done something and you've felt guilt for a while, and you've tried to squash it, you've tried to avoid it, you've tried to dismiss it, you've tried to move past it, you've tried to hide away from it, and it just grows heavy on you. And it is sapping your energy, it is draining you like standing outside in the middle of a hot summer's day. It is draining your energy in those moments. You know exactly what this might feel like, but you don't have to feel like that forever. Look what David did. Then I acknowledged my sin to you and did not cover up my iniquity. Acknowledge, saying, I know what I've done. I just don't just know, I'm acknowledging it. I'm admitting what I have done. I'm not trying to cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord. God, I know what I've done, and this is what I've done, and I am sorry. He's saying to God, you're the one who sets the standard right and wrong. I am sorry in that moment. And David teaches us something. He says the way to rid guilt is to admit guilt. That the way to rid guilt is to admit guilt. That's how it works. That if you would come and just like someone would admit themselves to hospital, just like someone would admit that. Why do you admit yourself to hospital? Because there is something broken on the inside that you cannot fix, and you need the help from someone. And so you admit yourself to hospital to receive the help of the doctors that are there. The same is true here. The way to rid guilt is to admit guilt. You see, what a therapist might tell you is to change the way you view things, to change the way that the standard by which you are feeling guilty by, and that might change that. But David didn't do that. David said, God, I'm coming to you first. You are the one I've sinned against. You are the one who sets the standard. I am sorry. I'm admitting my guilt to you. The way to get rid of guilt is to admit guilt. And I hope that if you're in that moment, I hope that you would do the same thing. That you would be honest to God and that you would admit your guilt. That you would be honest to God and that you admit your guilt. Because when you do, when you admit your guilt to God, you admit help from God. When you admit guilt to God, you admit help from God. That might be the very reason why you have resisted a relationship with God, that you don't want His help. You think, well, maybe if God was going to do nothing about the guilt that I'm experiencing and that He was going to ask me to do nothing, then I might have a conversation with God, but that's not the way it works, is it? That's not the way I think that this works, does it? I hope that if you're sitting here this morning that you would pay attention to what David is saying, that David was definitely guilty. But David took his guilt to the one who sets the standard of what is right and wrong. For some of you, guilt has been getting in the way of a relationship with God. And that if we were to be honest to God and admit our guilt, that when we admit our guilt to God, you admit the help from God. that you admit the help from a God who can fix the very thing that is broken inside of you. Now, as I've kind of been thinking about this and processing what types of people we might have in the room this morning, I've kind of come up with there's two types of people, I think, that as it relates to guilt, you might be responding. There are two types of people as it relates to responding to guilt. The first type is dismissing guilt. You might be here this morning and you might have been guilty of something. You might still be guilty of something, but you've decided you don't want to live with the feelings of isolation. You don't want to feel those shame feelings that you've had. You don't want to live under that anymore. So you've pushed that aside. You've kind of moved past that. You've tried to hide it. You've tried to dismiss those moments of guilt. You've tried to push them away and hide away from those things. You've tried to avoid them as much as you can. Can I just be honest with you on behalf of your family? Please, will you do an emotional inventory of your life? Because if that is you, I can tell you that the relationships around you are suffering. That is just the way life works. That if you are guilty of something and not dealing with that guilt, if you are just going through and just trying to dismiss that guilt, the people around you are suffering. And maybe today, you need to be honest with yourself so that you can be honest to God. The other group of people that I think are sitting here this morning are those that are dealing with guilt. Those of you that are dealing with guilt. And some of you are dealing with guilt well. Some of you have been like David and you are taking your guilt to God on a daily basis. You're saying, God, I have this guilt and this is what I'm dealing with, and you're dealing with it well, and you're receiving the forgiveness of God. That God is extending to you this forgiveness, and you're able to deal with your guilt. That God is able to help you resolve whatever you might be dealing with. Others of you, if you hear me say dealing with guilt, maybe you would say that past tense, you have dealt with guilt. And how about you? Have you ever met someone who has done something so terrible, and they have received the forgiveness of God, and it looks like they're dancing in the moonlight, and everything is feeling warm and bright? Isn't it just maddening? Doesn't it just get up in you? Like, why is that person, they've done something so terrible, why is it that they're able to just dance? Why they're experiencing this joy? What is that? There's the younger brother in the story of the prodigal son. If you're familiar with the story, this younger brother decides that his dad's dead. Not literally, figuratively, and claims his inheritance and decides that he's going to go to the city, and he literally squanders everything. He does all kinds of bad. And at literally the pit of what his life is, the lowest of lows, he decides, hey, maybe I should go back. Maybe I should go back to my father's household. Maybe he would receive me as a servant in his household. And so he decides and he goes back, and what does the father do? The father's there waiting for him. The father throws a massive party for him. And they get dancing, and there's food and all kinds of things. And the story tells us that the older brother is still in the field. He's still busy working, and he can hear the music. He can hear that there's a party going on. And he asks one of his servants, what's happening? What's going on? And he says, well, your brother's come back. We're rejoicing because your brother has come back. And if you remember the story, the older brother gets angry. He gets irritated. He's like, this guy doesn't deserve to be dancing. This guy deserves to be taken out into publicly shamed because of what he has done. He has dishonored our father. He deserves to wear a scarlet letter on his head in public so that every single person can know what he has done, and then he can live with the guilt, the shame of the guilt, the isolation of the guilt that comes along with what he has done. But you know what you and I should do if we run into someone who has done something terrible and has experienced the forgiveness of God? And they're dancing. We just need to find the beat. And we need to dance along with them, even if it's just side to side. We just need to find the beat. Because one day you're going to need the same grace. One day you're going to need the same forgiveness. And I think that God is faithful enough to extend to you and extend to me the same grace that they're experiencing. So it might be maddening to you, it might be frustrating to you that they are living like it's the summer of '69, but you just need to find the beat, and you just need to dance along with them. Some of you, when I say dealing with guilt, you're not dealing with guilt. Guilt is, in fact, dealing with you. You would say that guilt in that moment is dealing with you, that you have some guilt going on inside of you. There is guilt happening on the inside, and it is eating you alive. Maybe for some of you, as you think of guilt dealing with you, you've tried to maybe dismiss it. You've tried to maybe bury yourself in work, maybe in a hobby. Maybe you have been messing around with something and you have become addicted to something because it numbs the pain of the guilt that you feel on a daily basis. Maybe you are experiencing that the guilt is dealing with you. But I hope that you would hear what David says next. What David says next is amazing. He says, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. That God, I'm going to come to you, I'm going to confess what I've done, and you have forgiven. You forgave the guilt of my sin. What I hope that you would hear today is that God is a loving, He is a gracious, He is a compassionate Heavenly Father. And He wants to extend forgiveness to you. He forgave the guilt of my sin. You see, being honest to God about your guilt allows you to experience the relief of forgiveness. That yes, there is a release of forgiveness that comes from God, that God releases forgiveness to you and to me. And forgiveness sometimes can feel like a sigh of relief, but God extends that relief of forgiveness to you and to me. And no matter what we've done, the only way we can receive the release of forgiveness from God is to confess our sin. Is to confess our transgressions and do what David did. God, against you, you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. And you forgave my sin. That God, I've done some things. But God, I'm confessing them to you. And then as you confess, that God releases forgiveness to you. And you can experience the relief of forgiveness. Maybe you look at this and you're still wrestling with the idea that there's no way this can happen. That the level of guilt that you're dealing with, the level of guilt that you're experiencing is just so dire that there is no way that this can happen. I hope that you would see what David did and see what many people have done, that as they confess, that they would receive the relief of forgiveness from God. Because it's called grace. And you don't deserve it, I don't deserve it. That's why it's amazing. In fact, it's been called a scandalous grace because we don't understand it. It doesn't make sense to you, and it doesn't make sense to me. But God wants it for you, and He wants it for me. And so if guilt has gotten in the way of you having a relationship with God, there is something that you can do today. That you can come out of hiding and you can admit your guilt to God. That you can say, God, I'm tired of feeling these feelings of isolation and shame and hiding away from you. That God, I'm going to confess. I am going to tell you what I have done. You know already, but I want to tell you. I want to confess. I want to acknowledge what I have done. I'm going to admit to you so that I can deal with the guilt, that I can receive the relief of forgiveness. When I was in primary school, my family lived on a farm, and we used to have a lot of fun. There was a lot of space to ride around on, and our bikes were stored in an outside storeroom that backed onto the stables, and my dad would unlock it in the morning, and we'd be able to go get our bikes whenever we wanted to. But my dad stored his tools in there as well, and I love building things. I still do, and so I would often play with the tools and build stuff. I built a tree house and a couple of other things along the way, which was a lot of fun. But one day I decided to play a game, and I can best describe this game to you as hammer toss. We had paddocks around our house, so there was tons of space to be able to play this game. But the side of our house was about the size of the stage behind me, and we had very few windows that were about the size of an A4 sheet of paper, about this big. And I managed to throw a hammer through one of those windows, and unbeknown to me, my mother was sleeping on the bed underneath that window. And I did exactly what you would have done in that moment. I ran inside, apologized, cleaned up my mess. No, I didn't. I ran away and hid. In fact, I don't remember much about that day other than that part of the story, because I'm sure I hid forever. I asked our team to end with a song, and the song is called Come Out of Hiding, because I think it's appropriate that when we experience guilt, that's the first place we go. We go into hiding. And what's amazing about this song is written from God's perspective to you and to me. And there's a line in the song that says, "And I saw it all, but I still chose the cross." God's saying to you and to me that, hey, I've seen it all. I know what you've done. I know what is going on in your life, but I still chose the cross. And so I don't know what it is for you today that might be getting in the way of you having a relationship with God. But God designed you and me to have an unfiltered relationship with Him, that we would bring all our pain, all our anger, all our joy, all our excitement, all the fears that we have, all of the doubts that we have. And He invites us to bring all of our guilt to Him. Because that's the type of Father He is. He wants to know what we're feeling. He might already know. In fact, He does. But He wants to hear it from you. He wants an honest to God relationship. And I'm telling you, if you continue to withhold those things from Him, sin is going to cause more trouble in your life. But if you continue to withhold the honesty from Him, that withholding is going to cause more problems than the sin is going to cause you. And so I hope for you today that as you come, as you're able to sit and listen to these words, as God speaks to maybe you through this song, that you would realize that God has created a relationship, the potential of a relationship where it can be an honest to God relationship, where we're not meant to hold something back, that we are meant to bring our full selves to Him, that we can be honest to Him in whatever we might be experiencing. And so if guilt, if doubt, if something has been getting in the way of you having a relationship with God, I hope that today you might be honest to God, that you might be able to come out of hiding and admit what is going on. That perhaps today you'd be honest to God about the guilt that you're experiencing in your life. Let me pray for us. Father God, there might be people sitting here this morning. In fact, if you're sitting here this morning and you are dealing with some form of guilt, you're going through life and you're hiding, you're just wondering, is this guilt ever going to end? Is this feeling of overwhelming just pressure on my life going to end? If you would listen to this message and say, hey, that's me, I'm dealing with guilt, I'm somewhere in my life experiencing some form of guilt, I want to ask you, wouldn't you just raise your hand as a way of saying, hey, that's me, I'm dealing with guilt. It doesn't have to be high in the air, just as an acknowledgement, I'm dealing with that guilt and that's me. And if you don't want to if you don't want to raise your hand because maybe you realize it's going to cost you something, maybe it'll cost you everything, I want to pray for those of you that are in the room, those that raise their hands, those that can't. Because I think today we could come out of hiding and we could live in that relief of forgiveness that God offers to you and to me. It's called grace and we don't deserve it, but it is amazing. Father God, thank you for just that you are a loving, you're a compassionate, you're a gracious Father, that you invite us to bring all of ourselves, all of our emotions, our doubts, our anger, our guilt, our frustrations, our joy and our excitement to you. Father God, that you created us to have an honest to God relationship with you, that we would bring full disclosure. Father, I want to pray for those people who raised their hand. And Father, those people who didn't because they thought it was going to cost them everything. Father, I pray that they would be able to carve out some time, maybe today, maybe during the song, maybe in the next week. Father, they would say to you, I'm sorry. I'm feeling this pressure, I'm feeling burdened by this, but God, I'm sorry. I'm apologizing to you. You do with me what you would have do, but I'm admitting my guilt. And Father God, I look forward to the day that you're able to whisper to them, that moment when you whisper to them, I love you, and you're forgiven. Because that's the kind of Heavenly Father that you are to each and every one of us. Father God, thank you for your Son, Jesus, and it's in his precious name we pray. Amen.
Come out of hiding, you're safe here with me. There's no need to cover what I already see. And you've got your reasons, but I hold your peace. And you've been on lockdown, but I hold the key. 'Cause I loved you before you knew it was love, and I saw it all. Still I chose the cross, and you are the one that I was thinking of when I rose from the grave. Now rid of the shackles, my victory is yours. I tore the veil for you to come close. There's no reason to stand at a distance anymore. You're not far from home, and I'll be your lighthouse when you're lost at sea. And I will illuminate everything. No need to be frightened by intimacy. No, just throw off your fear and come running to me. Oh, 'cause I loved you before you knew it was love, and I saw it all. Still I chose the cross, and you are the one that I was thinking of when I rose from the grave. Now rid of the shackles, my victory is yours. I tore the veil for you to come close. There's no reason to stand at a distance anymore. You're not far from home. You're not far from home. Keep on coming. Keep on coming. And oh, as you run, what hindered love will only become part of the story. And oh, as you run, what hindered love will only become part of the story. And oh, as you run, what hindered love will only become part of the story. And oh, as you run, what hindered love will only become part of the story.